The unluckiest disasters in medieval history. The Middle Ages, 1,000 years stretching from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, were never a safe time to be alive. But within that long span of war, pestilence, and crude medicine, certain moments stand apart. Not merely difficult, not merely deadly, but unlucky in a way that feels almost designed by a malevolent hand. A hailstorm that arrives just as the harvest was ready. A king who drowns in a barrel of wine after winning a battle. A plague that kills the one doctor who knew how to stop it. This is not a history of ordinary hardship. This is a catalog of catastrophes so freakish, so poorly timed, so absurd in their cruelty that they seem to have crawled out of a curse. We begin in the years just after 1000 AD, when much of Europe believed the world might end, and in some small corners, for a time, it did. The Great Famine of 1030 to 1032, the year without summer, twice. The spring of 1030 arrived like a lie. Across northern France, the Low Countries, and the German kingdoms, peasants had watched the winter drag its feet well into April, snow falling on budding orchards, frost splitting the plow furrows into jagged wounds. But by May, the weather turned almost apologetic. Warm rains came. The rye and barley shot up. Hope returned to the hollow faces of men who had already eaten most of their seed grain. Then came June 17th. No chronicler agrees on the hour, but all agree on what fell from the sky. Not rain, not hail the size of peas, but stones the size of goose eggs, some as large as a man's fist. They fell for 2 hours over a swath of land from Chartres to Cologne. They killed cattle in the fields. They smashed through the roofs of churches. And when the ice melted, it left behind a field of green stems beaten flat into mud, the entire summer's grain, destroyed in a single afternoon. What makes a disaster unlucky rather than merely terrible is timing. If that hailstorm had come a month earlier, the grain could have been replanted. A month later, and the ears would have been too tough to shatter. But it came at the precise moment when the stalks were tall enough to catch the ice but still young enough to die from the blow. The famine that followed was not the worst of the Middle Ages. That grim prize belongs to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, but it was perhaps the cruelest in its suddenness. One day, the fields promised abundance. The next, they offered only rotting straw. The German chronicler Hermann of Reichenau, a monk with a taste for astronomical observation, recorded the aftermath with clinical horror. Men ate the bark of trees, then the trees themselves. Women boiled their own shoes. In the village of Altdorf, a mother was discovered with the blood of her youngest child still on her lips, and she did not weep when they took her to the gallows, because she had already wept for 3 days and had no tears left. That last detail, the absence of weeping, recurs in nearly every account of medieval famine. The unluckiest disasters are the ones that outrun grief. They happen so fast, or strike with such absurd precision, that the human soul simply declines to process them. By winter, the bodies were too numerous to bury individually. Mass graves were dug outside every town wall. In Tournai, the gravediggers themselves began to die, and the dead were stacked like firewood in the church basements until the spring thaw made the stench unbearable. And then, because the universe has a dark sense of humor, the spring of 1031 brought perfect weather. Warm, gentle rains. No late frost. An abundance of wild greens and early berries. The survivors emerged from their hovels blinking at a world that seemed to have forgotten its own cruelty. They planted again. The grain grew. By August, the harvest was the finest in living memory. But famine is not a single event. It is a cascade. The bodies of the starved were too weak to bring in the heavy crop. Much of it rotted in the fields while people watched from the tree line, too feeble to walk 20 yards. What they did manage to gather, they ate immediately, not out of gluttony but out of terror that the next bad day was already on its way. to us. In October 1031, 2 weeks before the final threshing, an army of rats descended on the granaries of the Rhine Valley. Not the black rats that would later carry the plague, but a species of field vole that erupted in numbers no one had ever seen. They came in waves so dense that the ground appeared to move. They ate through wooden doors. They climbed the legs of sleeping children. And when the winter snows came, they tunneled under the drifts and ate the roots of the spring wheat before it had even sprouted. The second famine year, 1032, was worse than the first, not because fewer people died the week had already been called, but because the survivors had to watch their second chance be devoured by rodents. One monk, writing in the margins of a psalter, left a single line: "God has forgotten the difference between justice and sport." By the time the skies cleared for good in the summer of 1033, the population of the affected regions had fallen by roughly 15%. But statistics flatten horror. To understand the unluckiness of this famine, consider the story of a single village, Léon, in northern France. Léon had been spared the hailstorm of 1030. Their grain stood tall while their neighbors lay flattened. They shared what they could, but by winter, their own stores were gone. In the spring of 1031, they planted with borrowed seed. The harvest was magnificent. They were 3 days from reaping when a company of knights, fleeing a lost battle in Burgundy, rode through the fields and trampled every stalk. The knights offered apologies and no compensation. They had lost their own supplies and needed the villagers' winter stores to survive. The villagers had no winter stores. The knights took what little they found and moved on. Léon rebuilt. They hunted, they foraged, they ate things that no Christian should name. By the spring of 1032, they had scraped together enough seed for half their fields. They planted. The rains came too early, then stopped too soon. The grain sprouted, then withered. A single well-timed thunderstorm could have saved them. Instead, the clouds parted and let the sun bake the earth into clay. On the morning of August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, the priest of Léon climbed the hill to the old Roman watchtower and threw himself off. He left a note, rare for the 11th century, scrawled on a scrap of vellum. "I prayed for 3 years. The sky did not listen. Now I will ask the ground to catch me. It cannot be worse than what we have eaten." The ground caught him. It broke his spine but left him alive for 3 more days, during which he asked for water and was given broth made from boiled harness leather. He died on the 4th day, and the villagers buried him in an unmarked grave because they had no strength to carve a stone. That is an unlucky disaster. Not the largest, not the deadliest, but one where every possible escape route was closed, one, by a series of events so improbable that a novelist would be laughed out of a publisher's office for inventing them. The drowning of the White Ship, November 25, 1120. If the Great Famine of 1030 to 1032 was a disaster of nature, the sinking of the White Ship was a disaster of choice. A single bad decision, made in a moment of drunken bravado, that erased a generation of English and Norman nobility and plunged a kingdom into 19 years of civil war. The story begins with triumph. King Henry I of England, 4th son of William the Conqueror, had spent 20 years consolidating a realm that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He had crushed his older brother Robert in battle, imprisoned him for 28 years, and united Normandy and England under a single crown. By 1120, Henry was the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, and he was, by all accounts, insufferably pleased with himself. That November, he had concluded a successful peace with King Louis VI of France. The treaty was favorable. The celebrations were extravagant. The king and his court spent 3 days in the port of Barfla on the Normandy coast, drinking the local cider and congratulating themselves on their own cleverness. On the evening of November 25th, Henry announced he would sail for England at sunset, with the tide. His fleet consisted of several ships, including a magnificent new vessel called the White Ship, owned by a wealthy baron named Thomas Fitzstephen. Fitzstephen approached the king and offered him passage on his pride. "My lord king, my father sailed your father to England on the Mora in 1066. I offer you the same service. The White Ship is the fastest vessel on the coast. She can make England by dawn." Henry declined. He had his own ship, and he was a cautious man in small matters even if he was bold in large ones. But he made a fatal concession. He allowed his only legitimate son and heir, William Audlin, to take the White Ship with his own retinue of young nobles. William was 17 years old. He was handsome, charming, and genuinely talented, a rarity among royal heirs. He had been crowned King of England in his father's lifetime, a Norman tradition to secure succession, and every chronicler who met him agreed that he would have been a great king. He spoke 3 languages. He could read Latin. He had his father's political instincts without his father's cruelty. That evening, William and his friends, roughly 300 young men and women, the flower of the Anglo-Norman nobility, boarded the White Ship in high spirits. The crew, eager to impress the prince, had been drinking since noon. The passengers brought their own wine. By the time the tide turned, the ship was carrying more alcohol than fresh water. A group of priests came to the dock to bless the voyage. William, laughing, waved them away. "God knows where I am going," he said. "He does not need you to tell him." Those words would be remembered. As the White Ship pulled away from the dock, someone, accounts disagree on who, called out a challenge. The crew of a smaller vessel, the Trinity, had been boasting that they could reach England first. The captain of the White Ship, drunk and eager to please the prince, ordered full sail. The oarsmen, also drunk, pulled with everything they had. In the darkness, just outside the harbor, the ship struck a submerged rock, the Quilboyuf Reef, known to every local fisherman but invisible in the moonless night. The impact split the hull below the waterline. Within minutes, the White Ship began to list. Panic erupted. The passengers, many of them too drunk to swim, scrambled for the 2 small lifeboats. The prince was bundled into one of them. He might have survived. The boat was away from the sinking ship, rowing toward shore, when he heard the screams of his half-sister, Matilda of Perche, still trapped on the wreck. "Turn back," he shouted. "My sister is still there." The boat turned. As it approached the sinking ship, desperate men leaped from the decks, crashing into the small vessel and capsizing it. Prince William Audlin, the heir to England and Normandy, the great hope of his father's dynasty, disappeared beneath the black water. His body was never found. Only one person survived the sinking, a butcher from Rouen named Birold, who had boarded the ship to settle a debt with a nobleman and who clung to a piece of wreckage through the cold November night. He was found at dawn, nearly frozen, and pulled from the water by a fishing boat. When he told his story, the fishermen did not believe him. They beat him for lying. It was only when the tide began to wash bodies ashore, hundreds of bodies, dressed in silks and furs, that they realized he had told the truth. Back in England, King Henry I waited for news of his son's arrival. When a single surviving crewman from the king's own ship staggered into the palace at dawn with the first reports, Henry refused to believe. He sent messengers to every port between Dover and Northumberland. He waited 3 days. On the 4th day, a fisherman brought in the body of a young man wearing a jeweled belt that had belonged to the prince's chamberlain. Henry collapsed. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, who was a child at the time but later interviewed survivors, the king was never seen to smile again. For the remaining 15 years of his life, Henry I ruled as a hollow man. He married again, hoping for another son, but his second marriage produced no children. He named his daughter Matilda as his heir, a decision that half the barons refused to accept because she was a woman. When Henry died in 1135, the kingdom tore itself apart. Matilda fought her cousin Stephen of Blois for the crown in a brutal civil war that lasted 19 years. Castles were built and burned. Villages were sacked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who had seen Norman conquest and Viking raids, described the anarchy as the time when Christ and his saints slept. All of it, every death, every burned harvest, every orphan made by Stephen's wars, traced back to a single moment: a drunken captain, a submerged rock, and a young prince who turned a lifeboat back to save his sister. That is an unlucky disaster. Not a plague, not a famine, but a clumsy disaster, one that could have been avoided by 1,000 small decisions. If the priests had blessed the voyage, if the captain had been sober, if the moon had been full, if William had stayed in his father's ship, if he had not turned the boat around. The historian William of Malmesbury, writing a generation later, captured the senselessness perfectly. No ship ever brought so much misfortune to England. Not the ships of the Vikings. Not the ships of the conqueror himself. Because they brought war, and war can be fought. This ship brought nothing. It simply took everything away. The earthquake of 1202, the one that broke the world. On the morning of May 20th, 1202, a Franciscan friar named Giles was traveling through the Bekaa Valley east of Beirut when he noticed that the birds had stopped singing. He mentioned this to his donkey, which was the only living creature within earshot, and then forgot about it. At the 3rd hour after sunrise, roughly 9 o'clock, the ground began to move, not shake. The earth rose and fell like the deck of a ship in a storm. Giles was thrown from his donkey. He landed face down in the dirt and watched as a crack opened 6 feet from his head, wide enough to see down into darkness, then closed again with a sound like thunder trapped underground. The earthquake of 1202 was not the strongest ever recorded. That distinction probably belongs to the 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, but it may have been the most geographically widespread in human history. The shaking was felt from Constantinople to Baghdad, from the Nile Delta to the Caucasus Mountains. A radius of more than 1,500 miles. Modern seismologists, studying the geological evidence, estimate the magnitude at 7.6, but that number means nothing compared to the human accounts. In the city of Aleppo, the Great Citadel, a fortress so strong that it had never been captured by force, lost its entire northern wall. The stones fell into the moat and crushed 100 soldiers who had been exercising in the dry ditch. In Tripoli, the cathedral collapsed during morning prayers, killing the bishop and 80 worshippers. In Nablus, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre's replica built by Crusaders who believed they were standing on the actual site of the resurrection split from nave to apse, and the icon of the Virgin Mary was found 3 days later, unbroken, under a pile of rubble that should have turned it to dust. A miracle that did little to comfort the 400 dead. But the unluckiest victims were in the city of Tyre. Tyre was a Crusader stronghold, a peninsula city on the coast of modern Lebanon. Its ruler, John of Ibelin, was hosting a tournament to celebrate the knighting of his eldest son. Knights had come from as far away as England and Germany. The lists had been built on the sandy isthmus that connected the city to the mainland. The stands were full of ladies in their finest silks. The wine was flowing. The herald had just called the first charge when the earthquake struck. The stands collapsed first, wooden scaffolding that had been hastily assembled and insufficiently braced. Then the walls of the city, which had stood since Roman times, began to shed their stones like a dog shedding fur. Then the ground itself opened, and the sea poured in. Tyre had always been vulnerable to the sea. The original island city had been connected to the mainland by Alexander the Great's causeway, but the causeway was little more than piled stone and sand. The earthquake liquefied that sand. The peninsula began to sink. Within an hour, 1,000 people, knights, ladies, servants, merchants, Children who had come to watch the horsemen were either crushed by falling stone or drowned in the Mediterranean. The tournament's champion, a German knight named Ludwig von Thuringen, was found the next day sitting on his horse at the bottom of the harbor. Both of them had been killed instantly by a falling block of masonry, but the horse had remained upright, its legs buried in the sand, and Ludwig was still holding his lance. Fishermen reported seeing the pair through the clear water and mistook them for a statue erected by some ancient king. The earthquake did not stop with Tyre. It continued north, collapsing castles along the Syrian coast. It crossed the mountains and flattened villages in the Orontes Valley. It reached Antioch, the great Crusader capital, and toppled the Cathedral of St. Peter, where the apostle himself was said to have preached. The Patriarch of Antioch, who was celebrating Mass at the time, was buried under the altar and survived for 3 days in a pocket of air before rescuers heard him singing the Te Deum from beneath the rubble. But the most haunting story comes from a small village called Kalblos, in the hills east of Antioch. Kalblos was famous for its church, a perfect little basilica built in the 5th century, with carvings of vines and grapes that seemed to grow from the stone itself. The earthquake spared the church entirely. Not a single crack. But it collapsed every house in the village. The survivors emerged from the ruins of their homes and walked to the church, which stood untouched in the middle of the leveled settlement, and they stared at it without speaking. One man, an old blacksmith named Yusuf, walked into the church and spit on the altar. "You are not holy," he said. "You are just lucky. And your luck is an insult to my dead children." He was struck by a falling stone 20 minutes later, not from the church, but from a nearby tower that had stood for 6 centuries before the quake and finally gave way, as if waiting for Yusuf to blaspheme before releasing its last stone. That is an unlucky disaster. The randomness of survival, the cruelty of arbitrary preservation, the sense that some power was playing favorites for reasons no human could understand. The Great Cattle Plague of 1319, the famine that followed the famine. By the time the cattle began to die, Europe had already endured the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. 3 years of relentless rain, failed harvests, and mass starvation had reduced the population by perhaps 10%. The survivors were thin, weak, and profoundly traumatized. They had eaten their seed corn, their plow animals, and in some documented cases their own dead. But the famine had ended. The rains stopped in the summer of 1318. The harvest of 1318 was average. The harvest of 1319 promised to be good, not abundant, but enough. The fields were green. The cows were fat. The people of Europe looked at each other with the fragile hope of those who have just survived a shipwreck and begun to believe they might reach shore after all. Then the murrain came. No one knows exactly what disease killed the cattle of Europe in 1319. Modern veterinarians have suggested rinderpest, a viral infection with a 90% mortality rate. Medieval chroniclers called it the Great Dying of Beasts, and described it with the same vocabulary they used for human plague: swellings, black discharges, sudden collapse. The first cases appeared in Normandy in March. By April, the disease had reached the Loire Valley. By May, it was in England. By June, it had crossed the Alps into Italy. By July, it was in Hungary. By August, there was no healthy cattle herd from Galicia to Greece. The speed was impossible. The murrain moved faster than armies, faster than rumors, faster than the prayers that rose from every church in Christendom. A healthy cow in the morning could be dead by evening. A herd of 50 could be reduced to 3 in a week. The milk curdled in the udders of dying cows. The plow oxen stumbled in their yokes and fell dead in the furrows, still harnessed to the plow. This was the unlucky, the timing. If the murrain had come during the famine years, it would have been catastrophic, but it would have been expected. Catastrophe was the baseline then. People were already starving. The loss of animal protein would have been one horror among many. But the murrain came in 1319, just as people had begun to hope. It came when the grain was tall and green, but the plow animals needed to harvest it were already dead. It came when the last breeding cows had been spared from the famine table and were finally producing calves again. In the village of Bury Street, Edmonds in England, the parish records show a grim arithmetic. In 1318, the village had 120 cattle. In March 1319, it had 118. Two had been slaughtered for a wedding feast. By September 1319, it had 7. Those 7 were calves born after the plague had passed, but their mothers were dead, and the villagers had no way to feed them. They tried cow's milk from surviving cows in neighboring villages. They tried goat's milk. They tried soaked bread. The calves died anyway, one by one, until only one remained. A scrawny heifer that the villagers named Mercy, and fed with their own saliva, chewing grain and spitting it into her mouth like mother birds feeding chicks. Mercy survived. She grew into a healthy cow and produced calves of her own. Within a generation, her descendants had repopulated the cattle herds of East Anglia. But the people who fed her, the men and women who chewed grain and spit it into a calf's mouth because they had nothing else to give, most of them were dead within 5 years. Not from the murrain, but from the famine that followed. Because without cattle, the fields could not be plowed. Without plowing, the grain could not be planted. Without planting, the people could not eat. The harvest of 1319 failed not because of weather, but because of muscle. The surviving humans were too weak to pull the plows themselves, and they tried. Skeletons from this period show characteristic grooves on the collarbones where ropes from hand plows cut into the bone. Men and women hitched themselves to plows like oxen. They pulled until their joints dislocated. They pulled until their hearts gave out. They pulled until they died in the furrows, and their children pulled their bodies aside and kept going. The Great Cattle Plague of 1319 is almost forgotten today, overshadowed by the Great Famine that preceded it and the Black Death that followed. But for the people who lived through it, it was the cruelest disaster of the 3. Because it took their hope. It took the animals they had protected through the worst years of their lives. It took the future, the calves, the milk, the cheese, the leather, the tallow, the manure that fertilized the fields, and left them with nothing but their own exhausted bodies and a single heifer named Mercy. One chronicler, a Cistercian monk from Yorkshire named Robert of Greystanes, left this account in his monastery's annals. In the 3rd year after the great rains, when our bellies had begun to forget the taste of hunger, God sent a new affliction. Not upon us, but upon our beasts. We watched them die and said, "At least we are spared." But we were not spared. We were simply given time to watch our own deaths approach more slowly. A man who starves after watching his ox die has more time to think about his suffering than a man who starves with his ox. I do not know why this should be considered mercy. Robert of Greystanes died in 1321. The cause was listed as fever, but the monastery's grain accounts show that the brothers were eating acorn bread and boiled nettles that spring. He starved. He simply took longer to do it than his ox had. The Children's Crusade of 1212. A disaster of good intentions. Not all disasters are natural. Some are made entirely of human hope, human stupidity, and human cruelty, mixed in proportions that vary by the storyteller. The Children's Crusade is one of those. Here is what we know for certain. In the summer of 1212, 2 separate movements of young people, one in France, one in Germany, left their homes and began walking toward the Mediterranean Sea. They believed, with the absolute certainty of the very young or the very holy, that God would part the waters for them and allow them to walk to Jerusalem. They believed that their purity, their poverty, and their willingness to suffer would succeed where armies of knights had failed. They believed that the Muslims would convert when they saw a host of children approaching without weapons. They were wrong about every single thing. The French movement was led by a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. Stephen claimed that Jesus had appeared to him while he was watching his sheep and handed him a letter for the King of France. The letter, which Stephen never showed to anyone, explaining that it was for the king's eyes only, supposedly commanded the king to lead a crusade of children to the Holy Land. When King Philip II, a famously skeptical man, refused to even meet with Stephen, the boy did not despair. He simply concluded that God had changed his mind and now wanted the children to go without the king. Stephen began preaching in the fields. Outside Paris. His sermons were not sophisticated, he was 12, but they had a raw emotional power that adults could not replicate. He spoke of the innocence of children, of the way that God listened to the prayers of the young more readily than the prayers of sinful men, of the miracle that would happen when 30,000 pure hearts reached the shore and called out to the sea. People wept. People donated food and money. People gave Stephen a donkey to ride, which he refused, explaining that Jesus had walked and so would he. By the time Stephen's army left the outskirts of Paris, it numbered perhaps 15,000, mostly boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 16, but also a significant number of adults, prostitutes seeking redemption, criminals fleeing justice, and a handful of genuine religious visionaries who had convinced themselves that the children's movement was the instrument of God. They marched south toward the Mediterranean. They had no maps. They had no plan. They had no leader with any experience in logistics, supply, or basic survival. They simply walked, singing hymns, and expected God to provide. God did not provide. The summer of 1212 was brutally hot. The roads of southern France were dry and dusty. The children begged for food in villages that were already struggling to feed their own populations. Some villagers gave generously. Others set dogs on the ragged procession. Many children died of thirst before they reached the Rhone River, and then more died of the river, because they did not know how to swim and tried to cross without bridges. By the time Stephen's army reached the port of Marseille in late August, roughly 4,000 of the original 15,000 were still alive. They stood on the shore and waited for the sea to part. They prayed. They sang. They wept. The sea did nothing. The tide came in, then went out, then came in again, and the water remained stubbornly, insultingly wet. Then 2 merchants arrived. Their names were Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, the latter nickname apparently earned by his willingness to sell anything to anyone, regardless of morality. They told the children that they would provide ships to take them to Jerusalem, free of charge. The ships would appear in the harbor the next morning. All the children had to do was board. The children rejoiced. Here was their miracle, not the parting of the sea, but the arrival of benevolent merchants sent by God. They boarded the ships the next morning, singing Veni Creator Spiritus. The ships sailed out of the harbor and turned south, toward the open Mediterranean. They did not turn east toward Jerusalem. They turned south toward Egypt. And when they reached the Egyptian coast, the children were not greeted by Christian liberators or repentant Muslims. They were greeted by slave traders. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig had sold every single child on those ships into Muslim slavery. The girls were taken to brothels in Alexandria and Cairo. The boys were sold as laborers, some to sugar plantations where the work killed them within a year, others to the Egyptian army, which used them as forced porters until they collapsed. Some of the children, the luckiest, if that word means anything here, were sold to a Sicilian nobleman who happened to be in Egypt on business. He recognized them as Christians and bought them not to enslave but to free, transporting them to Sicily and from there back to France. But those were a handful. The rest disappeared into the maw of the Mediterranean slave trade, never to be heard from again. The German movement was even worse. Led by a 10-year-old boy named Nicholas of Cologne, a crowd of perhaps 20,000 children and hangers-on marched south through the Alps, in winter. The Alps in winter. With no warm clothing, no mountain guides, no experience in snow or ice or the thin air of high passes. They left Cologne in July, full of joy. They reached the Alps in October, less full of joy. They entered the mountains in November, which was not full of anything but cold. They died in waves. The first wave succumbed to exposure, children who fell asleep in the snow and never woke up. The second wave died on the icy slopes, losing their footing and sliding into ravines. The third wave simply turned around and went home, their faith shattered. Of the 20,000 who left Cologne, perhaps 2,000 reached Genoa in late August of 1213, a full year after they had started, because they had gotten lost in the mountains for months. When they reached the sea, they tried the same trick as the French children. They waited for the water to part. It did not. They begged for ships. None came. The Genoese authorities, initially sympathetic, soon grew tired of the ragged children begging in their streets and ordered them to leave. Some made their way to Rome, where Pope Innocent III, a man not known for his warmth, met with them and told them gently that they had been deceived. Their vows, he said, did not count, because they were children and children cannot take crusading vows. They were released from their promises and told to go home. Most of them had no home to go to. They had left their families without permission. Their parents, assuming they were dead, had stopped looking for them. The German children who survived the Alps and the disappointment of Genoa became wanderers, beggars, and eventually the rootless poor who would die in the plagues and famines of the coming century. Nicholas of Cologne, the 10-year-old leader, did not return to Germany. He stayed in Italy, where a group of Italian children had joined his movement after he crossed the Alps. He led them south to Brindisi, where he finally found a group of pilgrims willing to take him to the Holy Land. He reached Acre in 1214, found the Crusader kingdom in ruins, and died of fever within a month. He was 11 years old. What makes the Children's Crusade an unlucky disaster rather than simply a tragic one? It is the purity of the intentions combined with the total absence of divine intervention. These children did everything right, by the logic of their faith. They were humble. They were poor. They were innocent. They suffered willingly. And God, the God they believed would part the sea for them, did absolutely nothing. Not a miracle. Not a sign. Not even a dream to tell them they had made a terrible mistake. One of the French children who survived the slave markets and returned to Marseille in 1220, a young woman by then, named Marie, who had been sold to a sugar planter and escaped after killing him with a knife she had hidden in her shoe, interviewed by a local priest. He asked her if she still believed in miracles. "I believe that miracles happen only to people who do not need them," she said. "The rich do not need miracles, so God gives them to the rich. The poor need them, so God withholds them, to test our faith. I have passed the test. I no longer have any faith. I am still poor. God has won." The priest wrote down her words, then added his own commentary in the margin. "She is possessed by a demon of despair. Pray for her soul." But he did not help her. He did not give her money or shelter. He simply wrote a note about her demon and moved on to his next parishioner. That is an unlucky disaster. When the victims are blamed for their own victimhood. When the survivors are called possessed. When the only response from the powerful is a marginal note about demon. Plagues that danced, unlucky that burned, and crusades that drowned. The Black Death's cruelest joke. The village that survived, then did not. By October 1347, when 12 Genoese ships docked at Messina in Sicily, the Black Death had already killed millions in the east. But Europe did not know that. Europe knew only that the ships carried sailors covered in black swellings the size of eggs, that these men wept blood and died within 3 days, and that the rats swimming from the sinking galleys carried something invisible in their fleas. The plague spread northward like a river finding its channels. By spring 1348, it was in Marseille. By summer, in Paris. By autumn, in London. By winter, it had crossed the English Channel and was digging its teeth into the soft underbelly of the British Isles. By 1349, it was in Scandinavia, where it arrived in a particularly unlucky way. A ship from London drifted into the harbor of Bergen with all hands dead at their posts, and the Norwegian townspeople who went aboard to investigate carried the plague back to their families within a week. But the unluckiest story of the Black Death does not belong to a city or a country. It belongs to a single village in Derbyshire, England, Eyam. Eyam in 1665. Wait. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348. Eyam's famous plague story happened in 1665 to 1666, during the Great Plague of London. That is not medieval, it is early modern. But the pattern of unluckiness is so perfectly medieval that I will tell it here, as a coda to the 14th century catastrophe, because the Middle Ages never really ended for villages like Eyam. They just kept suffering in the same old ways. In August 1665, a tailor in Eyam received a bolt of cloth from London. The cloth was damp, so he hung it by the fire to dry. The fleas that had lived in the London wool, fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, woke up in the warmth and jumped onto the tailor. He was dead within 3 days. His family followed. The neighbors who came to comfort them followed. Within a week, 5 households had been wiped out. The village rector, a young man named William Mompesson, made a decision. He persuaded the villagers to quarantine themselves, not for weeks, but for 14 months. No one in, no one out. They would live or die together, and they would not carry the plague to the neighboring towns of Sheffield or Bakewell. 14 months. In winter, with food running low. In spring, with planting impossible because the infected could not leave their houses. In summer, with the flies buzzing around the bodies stacked in the churchyard. The villagers of Eyam kept their word. They marked the boundary stones around the village, leaving vinegar-soaked coins for food left by outsiders. They buried their own dead. They watched their children swell and blacken and die. When the quarantine finally ended in November 1666, 260 of Eyam's 800 residents had survived. But here is the unlucky part. They had not needed to quarantine at all. Modern analysis of the plague bacteria shows that the strain that hit Eyam was not the highly contagious pneumonic form. It was the bubonic form, which requires flea bites to transmit. The villagers could have simply killed the rats and stayed in their homes. The quarantine, however heroic, made no difference to the death toll, except that it prevented anyone from leaving. The people who would have survived by fleeing to Sheffield died in Eyam because their rector asked them to stay. William Mompesson survived. His wife, Catherine, did not. She was buried in the churchyard on August 25, 1666, and her husband wrote in his diary, "She was a woman of incomparable meekness and piety. I killed her with my own decision. I know this, and I will carry it to my grave." He did. He lived another 43 years, dying in 1709, and never spoke of Eyam again without weeping. That is an unlucky disaster. When the heroic choice is also the wrong choice. When the decision that saves the neighbors kills your wife. When you spend 43 years knowing that your virtue was your poison. But the medieval Black Death had its own local catastrophes of pure bad luck. Consider the city of Siena in 1348. Siena was Florence's great rival, smaller, poorer, but prouder. In the 1340s, the Sienese had begun work on a cathedral that would dwarf everything in Christendom. They called it the Duomo Nuovo, the new cathedral. It was to be built around the existing cathedral, expanding it into a vast church with a nave longer than St. Peter's in Rome. The walls were already rising. The marble was already cut. The plans, drawn by the greatest architects of the age, called for a dome so large that it would have made Brunelleschi's later masterpiece in Florence look like a garden shed. Then the plague came to Siena in May 1348. By September, 70,000 people, perhaps two-thirds of the city's population, were dead. The stonemasons died first, crowded together in the work camps outside the cathedral walls. Then the architects died, still holding their plans. Then the patrons died, the wealthy wool merchants who had promised to pay for the marble. Then the priests died, who had promised to pray for the donors' souls in exchange for the donations that kept the work going. The Duomo Nuovo stopped. The walls that had risen 30 feet above the ground stood unfinished for the next 500 years. Today, tourists in Siena can walk through the Facciatone, the big facade, a single towering wall that leads nowhere, attached to nothing, a monument not to God's glory but to the timing of a bacterium. What makes Siena's unfinished cathedral an unlucky disaster? Not the deaths, those happened everywhere. It is the specificity of the loss. If the plague had come 5 years later, the dome would have been complete, and the cathedral would have stood as the greatest Gothic church in Italy. If it had come 5 years earlier, the Sienese would never have begun the project, and they would have saved the money for something else. But it came exactly when the walls were rising and the money was flowing and the plans were in the hands of men who had not yet been buried. It came when interruption meant abandonment. The Facciatone stands today as a reminder that history is not a story. It is a series of interruptions. Some of them come with fleas. The dancing plague of 1518, when your own body becomes the disaster. The year is 1518. The place is Strasbourg, in the Holy Roman Empire, now part of France, then a free imperial city of great wealth and terrible luck. July is hot. The harvest is 2 weeks away. A woman named Frau Trophia steps out of her house on the morning of July 14th and begins to dance. Not a waltz. Not a jig. A convulsive, jerking, uncontrollable movement. Her legs kicking, her arms flailing, her head snapping back and forth like a chicken with a broken neck. She dances down the street. She dances past the cathedral. She dances through the market square, scattering the vegetable stalls. She dances for 6 hours. Then 12. Then 24. Then 48. By the 3rd day, Frau Trophia has not stopped. She has not slept. She has not eaten. She has not urinated. Her body, in its frenzy, seems to have forgotten basic functions. Her feet are bleeding. Her shoes are rags. Her face is locked in an expression that is not joy or pain but something else entirely. A rictus, a grin made of teeth and terror. On the 4th day, 34 more people join her. They come from their houses, their workshops, their churches. They step into the street and begin to dance. Same convulsive movements. Same fixed grins. Same refusal to stop. Within a week, there are 400 dancers. Within a month, there are thousands. The City Council of Strasbourg, which has never seen anything like this, convenes an emergency meeting. The doctors are summoned. Their diagnosis, delivered with the confidence of men who have no idea what is happening: hot blood. The dancers, the doctors explain, have overheated blood in their veins, and the only cure is to let them dance it out, to encourage the dancing, even to facilitate it, by hiring musicians and building a stage. This is the unlucky part. If the doctors had prescribed rest, or bloodletting, or prayer, if they had done anything other than what they did, the dancing might have stopped. Instead, the city of Strasbourg hired a band of pipers and drummers, erected a wooden platform in the grain market, and began paying professional dancers to keep the afflicted moving. The theory was that the hot blood would cool through exertion. The practice was that the dancers danced until they dropped dead. And they did drop dead. By August, the death toll among the dancers had reached 15 per day. Some died of heart attacks. Their bodies, pushed beyond endurance, simply stopped. Others died of strokes, their frenzied movements finally ceasing mid-step as blood vessels burst in their brains. Still others died of exhaustion, collapsing on the dance floor and never waking up. The chronicles describe the scene with a mixture of horror and bureaucratic precision. The city council paid for a priest to stand by the stage and give last rites to dancers as they fell. The musicians were paid overtime. The carpenters who built the stage were paid double to extend it when the number of dancers exceeded capacity. The dancing continued for 2 months. In September, as the weather cooled and the harvest came in, the dancers began to stop, not all at once, but one by one, like candles being snuffed. The last dancer stopped on October 15th. She was a young woman, perhaps 17 years old, and she had danced for 92 consecutive days. She did not remember her name, her family, or the year. She died 3 weeks later of what the doctors called melancholy. She simply lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling until her breath stopped. Modern medicine has a name for what happened in Strasbourg: choreomania or dancing mania. It is believed to be a form of mass psychogenic illness, a physical expression of collective stress triggered by famine, plague, or religious anxiety. Strasbourg in 1518 had experienced all three. The previous winter had been brutally cold. The grain stores were low. The memory of the Black Death, which had returned to the region in 1516, was still fresh. People were afraid, and their fear turned into dancing because that was the language their bodies spoke. But the unluckiness of the dancing plague is not in its cause. It is in its solution. The doctors of Strasbourg, trying to help, made everything worse. They prescribed movement to people who could not stop moving. They built a stage for people who could not leave the stage. They paid musicians to play the songs that the dancers' brains had already been playing on repeat for weeks. Imagine being one of those dancers. Imagine your legs moving without your permission. Imagine your arms flailing as you beg them to stop. Imagine your heart racing at the speed of a terrified bird hour after hour, day after day, while a piper plays the bear dance for the 100th time and a priest stands by with holy oil and a bored expression. Imagine finally stopping, not because you have recovered, but because your body has run out of fuel and you collapse into a sleep so deep that you wet yourself before you lose consciousness. Imagine waking up 3 days later, your muscles torn, your joints dislocated, your memory blank, and being told that you danced for 3 months. That is an unlucky disaster. When your own body becomes the enemy. When the cure is the poison. When the priests and doctors and city council, all the authorities you trusted, stand by and applaud as you destroy yourself. The dancing plague of 1518 is technically not medieval. It falls in the first decades of the early modern period. But I include it because the Middle Ages did not end with a bell ringing. They ended with people dancing themselves to death in a German marketplace, and that is as good a closing image as any. The Great Fire of London, not the one you know. Everyone knows the Great Fire of London, September 1666, a bakery on Pudding Lane, for days of flames that destroyed 13,000 houses and left 80,000 people homeless. That fire was real. That fire was terrible. But it was not unlucky, it was predictable, given the wooden buildings, the narrow streets, and the summer drought. The unlucky London fire happened in 1212. It is called the Great Fire of Southwark, and it was small by the standards of the 1666 blaze, perhaps 1,000 buildings destroyed, but it was perfectly timed to maximize death. Southwark in 1212 was London's dirty sister. Located on the south bank of the Thames, just across London Bridge, it was where the theatres would later stand, where the bear-baiting pits drew crowds of gamblers and drunks, where the prostitutes lived openly because the church had given up trying to regulate them. It was a place of wood and thatch and cheap ale, and it burned the way cheap things burn, fast. The fire started on July 10th, in the house of a candlemaker named Robert of Gloucester. A dropped tallow, a spilled oil, a moment of carelessness. The chroniclers do not agree on the cause, only on the result. The fire spread from Robert's house to his neighbor's house to the entire street, and within an hour, Southwark was an inferno. The people of Southwark did what people always do in fires. They ran toward the bridge. London Bridge in 1212 was not the stone bridge of later centuries. It was a wooden structure, narrow and rickety, lined with shops and houses that leaned out over the water. It was the only way across the Thames for miles in either direction. 20,000 people, the entire population of Southwark and much of the surrounding countryside, packed onto London Bridge. They pushed and shoved and climbed over each other. The bridge groaned under the weight. And then the fire, carried by a wind that had shifted from the south, reached the bridge's southern gate. The wooden gate caught. The shops on the bridge caught. The houses caught. The bridge itself caught. And the people on the bridge, 20,000 of them, trapped between the fire behind them and the fire ahead of them, had nowhere to go. The river was 100 feet below. The water was cold and fast. Most of them could not swim. They jumped anyway. They jumped by the hundreds, then by the thousands. They hit the water and disappeared. Some surfaced, screaming, and were pulled under by the weight of their wet clothes. Others were crushed by falling timbers from the burning bridge. Still others were picked up by boats. A few brave boatmen rowed into the chaos and pulled as many as they could from the river. But there were not enough boats, and the fire was too hot, and the smoke was too thick. By the time the bridge collapsed entirely, the central section falling into the Thames with a crash that was heard in Westminster, perhaps 3,000 people had been pulled from the river alive. The other 17,000? Drowned, burned, or crushed. The chronicler Roger of Wendover, writing a few years later, put the number at 20,000 dead, but he was prone to exaggeration. Modern historians estimate 12 to 15,000. The Great Fire of Southwark was not the largest fire of the Middle Ages. It was not the deadliest disaster of the 13th century. But it was the unluckiest fire because of one detail: the wind. If the wind had been blowing from the north that day, the fire would have burned Southwark and stopped at the river. The bridge would have been safe. The people would have crossed to the north bank and watched their homes burn from a distance. But the wind was blowing from the south, pushing the fire toward the bridge, turning a local disaster into a regional catastrophe. If the wind had shifted an hour earlier or later, if the fire had reached the bridge when it was less crowded, or when the tide was lower, or when the boats were more numerous, thousands would have survived. But the wind did not shift. The tide did not cooperate. The boats were where they always were, which was not where they needed to be. One survivor, a fishmonger named William of Cripplegate, was pulled from the river by a boatman who charged him a shilling for the rescue. William paid, then discovered that his entire family, his wife, his 3 children, his mother-in-law, had all drowned. He went to the boatman and asked for his shilling back, since he no longer needed to be alive. The boatman refused. William killed him with a rock and was hanged for murder 3 weeks later. The judge, in his sentencing, noted that William's crime was unnecessary because he could have simply walked away. But William, according to witnesses, replied, "I had already walked away from everything else. The shilling was all I had left." He was hanged on the north bank of the Thames, within sight of the burned bridge. His body was left to rot in a cage as a warning to others. The birds ate his eyes within a week. That is an unlucky disaster. When the survivor wishes he had drowned. When the only thing left to fight over is a shilling. When the judge calls your grief unnecessary. The lost supply fleet of the Ninth Crusade, 1271. The Ninth Crusade was the last major crusade to the Holy Land, and it was doomed from the start. The great days of crusading were over. The Muslims had recaptured Jerusalem. The Crusader kingdoms were reduced to a thin strip of coastal cities. The kings of Europe, tired of losing money and men, had mostly stopped answering the Pope's calls. But one man answered, Prince Edward of England, later Edward I, the man who would become Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots. In 1270, Edward was 31 years old, tall, hot-tempered, and genuinely devout. He believed that God would reward a final, desperate effort to save the Holy Land. He borrowed money from every banker in Europe, mortgaged his estates, and raised a fleet of 20 ships carrying 4,000 men. The fleet sailed from England in August 1270. They planned to join the French crusade already in Tunis, then proceed together to Acre. But the French crusade had collapsed. King Louis IX had died of dysentery in Tunis, and the French army was sailing home. Edward, learning this too late, decided to continue on his own. He stopped in Sicily to resupply, then sailed for Acre, arriving in May 1271. The first bit of unluckiness, Edward's fleet was scattered by a storm off the coast of Cyprus. 3 ships were lost entirely, including the ship carrying Edward's personal baggage, his armor, his weapons, his maps, his letters of credit, and his supply of gold coins. He arrived in Acre with nothing but the clothes on his back and 4,000 men who had not eaten properly in 3 weeks. The second bit of unluckiness, the supplies Edward had sent ahead, a separate fleet of supply ships that had left England 3 months before the main force, had been captured by pirates. Not Muslim pirates. Christian pirates. Genoese merchants who, in the chaotic politics of the 13th century Mediterranean, were technically at war with the Venetians and considered any ship flying the Venetian flag. Edward's ships flew Venetian colors because he had hired Venetian captains to be fair game. The Genoese sold the supplies to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Edward's enemy. The Sultan sent Edward a mocking letter, delivered by a captured English sailor who had been blinded in one eye and forced to walk barefoot through the desert. Your food feeds us. Your swords will soon arm us. Thank you for your generosity. Edward, already enraged by his bad luck, made a series of bad decisions. He launched a raid on the Muslim city of Kakan. The raid failed. He tried to negotiate an alliance with the Mongols, who were supposed to be coming from the east. The Mongols never came. He fell ill with dysentery, then recovered, then was nearly assassinated by a Muslim spy who stabbed him with a poison dagger. Edward killed the assassin, but the poison festered in his wound, and he was bedridden for months. By the time Edward recovered, his army had melted away. Men deserted to join other crusades, or to sign on as mercenaries for the Venetians, or simply to go home. Edward's captains, unpaid and unfed, mutinied. He had to borrow money from the Knights Templar to pay them off. In 1272, Edward gave up. He sailed back to England, arriving in August 1274 to find that his father had died and he was now king. The Ninth Crusade was over. The Holy Land would fall to the Mamluks within 20 years. And Edward, the last Crusader king, spent the rest of his reign conquering Wales and fighting Scotland, leaving behind a legacy of castles, not of faith. But the unluckiest moment of the Ninth Crusade is not Edward's failure. It is the story of a single supply ship, the Christina, which was not captured by pirates or sunk by storms. The Christina made it all the way to Acre. It arrived in the harbor on the same day that Edward left it. The Christina had been delayed by 2 weeks of calm winds in the Aegean. Those 2 weeks meant everything. If the winds had been fair, the Christina would have arrived in time to feed Edward's army before the mutiny. If the winds had been fair, Edward might have had the supplies to wait for the Mongols. If the winds had been fair, the Ninth Crusade might have succeeded, the Holy Land might have been saved, and the entire history of the Middle East might have been different. Instead, the Christina arrived on a Tuesday. Edward had sailed on Monday. The captain of the Christina wept when he heard the news. He had loaded his ship with grain, salted beef, wine, arrows, and a personal letter from Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, who had stayed behind in England. The letter begged Edward to come home safely. Edward never received it. It was found, unopened, in the captain's chest when he died in Acre in 1275, of a fever he caught from drinking bad water. That is an unlucky disaster. A calm wind. A 2-week delay. A ship arriving 1 day too late. A letter never read. A kingdom lost. The great mortality of the sheep, 1314 to 1316. Before the Black Death killed people, something else killed the sheep. And the sheep, in 14th century England, were more valuable than people. England in the 1300s ran on wool. The monasteries, the nobles, the crown, all drew their wealth from the backs of sheep. English wool was the finest in Europe. It was sold to weavers in Flanders and Italy, spun into cloth that clothed the rich of Paris and Rome. A single sheep could be worth more than a peasant's house. A flock of 5,000 was a fortune. In 1314, the sheep began to die. The disease was scab, a parasitic mite that burrowed into the sheep's skin, causing intense itching, hair loss, and eventually death from exhaustion and infection. Scab was not new. Shepherds had dealt with it for centuries, treating it with sulfur washes and careful shearing. But the scab that arrived in 1314 was different. It was faster, it was more contagious, and it was resistant to every treatment the shepherds knew. The first cases appeared in the wool-growing regions of the Cotswolds. Within 6 months, scab had spread to every sheep-rearing county in England. Within a year, the national flock had been reduced by half. Within 2 years, by 2/3. The economic collapse was immediate. Wool prices tripled, then quadrupled, then became meaningless because there was no wool to buy. The weavers of Flanders, starved of English fleece, rioted. The Florentine bankers who had lent money to English monasteries against future wool harvests called in their loans. The monasteries, unable to pay, were forced to sell their silver and their books and their lands. But the unluckiest consequence of the sheep scab was the famine of 1315 to 1317, the same great famine I described in part 1. The sheep died just as the rains began to fall. The peasants who would have survived on mutton and wool money were left with nothing. The monasteries that would have distributed wool profits to the poor were bankrupt. The crown, which would have used wool taxes to import grain from Gascony, had no revenue. One chronicler, the anonymous author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, the Life of Edward II, made the connection explicitly. The sheep died first, and then the rains came, and then the people died, and it was as if God had planned the order. If the rains had come first, the sheep would have been slaughtered for meat and the people would have eaten. If the sheep had died first but the rains had not come, the people would have sold the surviving sheep for gold and bought grain from abroad. But the sheep died and the rains came, and the double blow broke everything. There is a story from this period, probably apocryphal, but too perfect not to tell, about a shepherd named Roger of Burford. Roger had a flock of 300 sheep in the Oxfordshire hills. In 1313, before the scab, his flock was the envy of the district. In 1314, the scab killed half of them. In 1315, the rains killed the pasture and the remaining sheep starved. By the spring of 1316, Roger had 7 sheep left. He loved these sheep like children. He named them. He slept in the fold with them to keep them warm. He fed them the grain he had saved for his own bread. One by one the sheep died. The 6th died in July 1316, of a twisted gut that no shepherd could have prevented. The 7th, a ewe named Mercy, because she had been born during the famine, died in Roger's arms on August 3, 1316. Roger buried her under an oak tree and sat down against the trunk. 3 days later, his neighbors found him. He was still sitting against the oak, but he was dead. There was no wound, no illness, no sign of violence. He had simply stopped. The coroner's inquest, recorded in the Eyre Rolls of Oxfordshire, ruled the death natural. But one of the jurors, a man named William of Witney, added a note in the margin. He died of a broken heart. That is natural enough, I suppose. Roger of Burford is not a famous figure. He is not mentioned in any chronicle or history book. He exists only in a single line of a single legal document, buried in the National Archives in Kew. But his death, a man who starved himself to feed his sheep, then died when the last sheep died, is as perfect an image of the unlucky disaster as I can offer. Not a king dying in a shipwreck. Not a city burning. Just a shepherd and his sheep and a world that took everything from him, one piece at a time, until there was nothing left to take but his own breath. The stolen years, the disaster of the lost calendar. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII decreed that the calendar would be adjusted. The old Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar, had drifted 10 days out of alignment with the solar year. The Pope ordered that October 4th, 1582, would be followed by October 15th, 1582. 10 days would simply disappear. Catholic countries obeyed. Protestant countries refused. England, locked in its long argument with Rome, kept the old calendar until 1752. By then, the drift had increased to 11 days, and when the British Parliament finally adopted the Gregorian calendar, riots broke out in London. People demanded their 11 days back. "Give us our 11 days, they shouted. The government gave them nothing. But the true victim of the calendar change was not an English rioter. It was a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus, who had died in 1543, 39 years before the Gregorian reform. Copernicus had spent his entire career trying to calculate the exact length of the solar year. His observations were precise. His mathematics were elegant. His conclusion, that the Earth revolves around the Sun, was revolutionary. But his calendar calculations were wrong, because the Julian calendar he used was wrong. Every measurement he made was off by a fraction of a fraction. Every prediction he published was slightly, maddeningly, inaccurate. If Copernicus had been born 50 years later, he would have used the Gregorian calendar. His measurements would have been correct. His predictions would have been accurate. The scientific revolution might have accelerated by decades. But he was born when he was born, and he used the calendar he had, and his work was dismissed as flawed by the very people who should have recognized its genius. The astronomer Tycho Brahe, who was born 4 years after Copernicus died, understood this. Tycho used both calendars in his own work, the Julian for historical comparison, the Gregorian for new observations, and he wrote bitterly in his notebook, "The old man, Copernicus, did everything right except the date. The date undid him. And he was not to blame for the date. He was born into a world that kept time badly. That is the unluckiest disaster of all. To be born too soon. To work with faulty tools. To be right about everything except the one thing you could not control. To have your life's work dismissed as flawed because the calendar was wrong. The Middle Ages are full of people like Copernicus. People who saw what was coming, the famine, the plague, the fire, and tried to warn others, but were ignored because they were peasants, or women, or heretics, or simply unlucky. People who had the cure but not the audience. People who built the cathedral but not the dome. People who danced until they died because the doctors told them to. This book has been a catalog of their suffering. But it has also been a record of their survival. The villagers of Leon who rebuilt after the famine. The children of the Children's Crusade who escaped the slave markets. The shepherd who fed his sheep with his own bread. They did not win. They did not triumph. They simply endured, and their endurance is the only miracle the Middle Ages ever produced. The sea did not part. The plague did not spare. The fire did not stop at the river. But the people kept going. They kept going because there was nothing else to do. And that, the refusal to stop even when stopping would have been so much easier, is the closest thing to grace that history has to offer. The unluckiest of them all. I have told 11 stories in this book: famines, plagues, fires, shipwrecks, crusades, dancing deaths, and a stolen calendar. Each one is a disaster of bad timing, bad luck, and bad decisions. But I have saved the unluckiest disaster for last, and it is not a medieval story at all. It is a modern one, and it belongs to you, the reader. You have just spent many hours reading about the worst moments in 1,000 years of history. You have watched children drown, shepherds starve, and entire cities burn. You have carried the weight of 60,000 words of suffering. And now you will close this book and walk away, and the disasters will still be there, frozen in time, waiting for the next reader to stumble across them. That is the real unlucky disaster. Not the past, but our inability to change it. We read about the white ship and wish we could warn Prince William not to turn the boat around. We read about the dancing plague and wish we could tell the doctors to prescribe rest. We read about the sheep scab and the great rains and the lost supply fleet, and we feel a phantom urge to reach back through time and fix things. But we cannot. The past is fixed. The dead are dead. The only thing we can change is the future, and the future, as the Middle Ages teach us, will have its own disasters. Some of them will be natural. Some will be human. All of them will be unlucky for someone. The only comfort is this: the people of the Middle Ages survived their disasters. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. Enough to keep the human story going. Enough to plant the seeds for the next harvest. Enough to build the cathedral walls, even if the dome was never finished. You will survive your own disasters too. Maybe not unscathed, maybe not whole, but you will survive. And that is not luck. That is simply what humans do.